Do you think today the Russians, let's stick with the Russians, but you could say Russian, Chinese, Iranians, but let's say, do you think the Russians are able to black out a large section of the nation, let's say 10 million people? Do you think they're in a position today where they're able to do this? This is very exciting. Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. I'm very excited about today's episode. My guest is Nicole Perlroth. She is a reporter with the New York Times. She covers cybersecurity and the digital espionage beat. But the reason I have her on the show is she has a new book out called This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. So welcome to the show, Nicole.
Thanks for having me, Dale. This is pretty fun.
Yeah, I've been excited about reading your book since I heard about it a few years ago, but it's done well. It came out in February. I checked yesterday. It was on a number of the Amazon bestseller list, number one on a number of different categories, and it actually made your own publication, the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list, at least 1 week in February. So that's really great reception for your book. You must be very happy with that.
Yes. I mean, I wrote this for a lay audience, but I didn't think very many people were going to want to read a book about cybersecurity named This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends in the middle of the pandemic. So I'm very happy that it's done so well so far.
Well, we're going to cover a lot of ground here. I want to talk about your journey through the zero-day world, talk a little bit about the themes and lessons from the book, and then of course, we got to talk a little bit towards the back third about the ICS part of the book and the critical infrastructure part of the book. But one of the reasons I really wanted to have you on is, as far as I could tell from the journey perspective, you cover things going way back many decades, but from your own personal journey, it seemed like it started at S4 in January of 2013. That's where this whole zero-day journey began. I was wondering, when you came down to S4 that year, were you coming down trying to get information on 0 days, or what was your purpose of coming to the event, if you remember it?
I remember just thinking it was fascinating that there was a conference dedicated to ICS security in those days. You know, I had been to RSA, I had been to DEF CON and Black Hat, and the conference you put on was so specific to industrial control security. And I had stopped by, you know, some of I can't remember whether they had ICS Village back in the day, but, you know, I had talked to people around SCADA security. And this was the first conference I knew that was just specifically focused on it. And it was really, I had no idea that Revuln would be there that year. And so, you know, I had heard murmurings of a 0-day market. Andy Greenberg had written that fantastic piece in Forbes magazine, detailing the GRUC and listing some of the pricing around 0 days. But what stunned me going to that conference was that there was an outfit that was actually selling 0 days in ICS systems. That seemed like a completely different flavor of the market that I was just not even aware of. So I think the story I ended up writing off the conference was a story about a little bit about Revuln. I think they had a big picture in the story. And then a little bit more about where the 0-day markets were headed in terms of foreign customers. And so that was just eye-opening. I wasn't going to the conference thinking this was the story I was going to write. I don't even think I knew they would be there.
And then for those of you who haven't read the book yet, and you need to read the book, I think it's a fun read. I think people would enjoy the read, even if they know the 0-day market in this. It's a very interesting read. But chapter 2 is the fucking salmon, and it has to do with the dinner that I invited you and Kelly Jackson Higgins, 2 reporters, as well as Ralph Langner, and then Luigi and Donato from Revuln. And really at the time, we were so excited to be getting more mainstream media coverage of this issue that we wanted to kind of expose you to some of the luminaries in the field. But you ended up making it a whole chapter. Why don't you tell that story briefly from your point of view? What stood out there?
Well, okay, and I describe this in the book. And like I just said, I knew there was a 0-day market. I had tried to talk to the Grek before, and it was something that he clearly didn't want to talk about. I think he had some PTSD from that Forbes story. But I just thought it was fascinating in general that taxpayer dollars would go to governments that would acquire vulnerabilities in software and hardware, and that whole deal would necessitate that it would have to leave those holes open for the rest of us, even if it meant that they were just only being used for their counterintelligence operations. But going to the conference that year, I remember the first thing that happened was we went out to dinner. I think it was the first night I got there.
It was, yeah.
And what I remember was sitting next to Ralph and Luigi and Donato and you and Kelly being there. And that was the first time I ever met Ralph too. And he is just such a character of his own. And such a German, he really reminds me, a lot of my relatives are Dutch and German. And so I really identified with his sort of straightforward directness. And then there was Luigi and Donato. And we were just getting a sense at that dinner of what their business model was, which was selling 0 days in ICS systems. And like I said, that is the first time I'd ever heard of anyone selling a 0 day in a critical industrial control system. And so I remember asking, who will you sell these to? Who will you not sell these to? A number of different ways. And I knew that yes, I remember asking it sort of non-directly. And then I think I finally asked it very directly. And I think the direct question was, who will you not sell these to? Iran, China. And I remember Luigi spoke the better English of the two. And so I directed it at him. And I remember him staring down at the plate. And I remember we were at Michi's, which was one of your favorite restaurants and was delightful. And I had waited until we were a couple glasses of wine deep to ask the more direct question. So I said, who won't you sell this to? And he looked down at his salmon, and it was the longest pause in a conversation I think I've ever experienced in my career, certainly. I mean, I've asked a number of difficult questions in interviews before, but what I also was picking up was Ralph's reaction. And I think Ralph was just staring at them, waiting for an answer. And I knew a little bit about Ralph's history. I had watched the TED Talk. I knew that he was the first to have the balls to call out the US and Israel as the architects behind Stuxnet. I knew that this was his specialty. And the longer Luigi took to answer the question, the more tense I could feel Ralph getting. And finally, Luigi said, I could answer your question, but I would much rather talk about my salmon. And I remember Ralph just kind of exploding and turning to me and saying, Nicole, these guys are young. They have no idea what they're doing. They have no idea where this is going. And then turning back and saying, but go ahead, tell us about your fucking salmon. And I remember him using the F word. Ralph is very polite, but he's very direct, and I don't think he's scared to use that language. And then I remember Luigi never answering the question. So I know you and I have both kind of reminisced about this dinner over the years, and you have a different take on it that's more of a cultural take. The only thing I will say about that is I asked the question so many different ways, and he never answered it. So even if he really did want to talk about his salmon, and like I said, my family all comes from Europe. They think it's very strange that in the United States, we go immediately to business at the dinner table, and that we talk about business and we ask the question, what do you do? And that question suddenly defines you. They don't talk about those things when we're in Europe. So I understand sort of the cultural differences in conversation. But what I was picking up was someone who, yes, might have been very interested in thinking about the intricacies of the way his salmon was cooked and how it tasted. But I also remember, from my perspective, asking him a number of different ways.
Oh, yeah.
Who do you sell these 0 days to? And him never answering, and knowing full well that this was a question that no one in his industry would answer.
Yeah. And I guess I think I'm completely in line with you there. Maybe the only difference I have was I do believe he was thinking about his salmon. And I think in his mind, there was zero chance he was going to tell you anything. So it wasn't he was struggling with, how do I answer this? What do I say? I think he's just just as you said, he's very confident in what he is going to say and what he's going to do. And he just, no, I don't talk about that. I'm never going to talk about that. You can ask me 27 different ways and I'm still not going to talk about it. And that kind of launched you into this world where you ran into that a lot. So you went, this was, as I looked in the book, it was over a 7-year journey of you actually looking at people that buy and sell these 0-day vulnerabilities, these vulnerabilities that the vendors and the customers don't know about. Hence, they'll be very successful. So you went through this world. And when I looked at the book, I did this with Andy Greenberg's book too, his Sandworm book. I said, who's the hero of the book? And I think in Andy Greenberg's book, although he said there were many heroes, I think it was the researchers in his book. I was thinking, who's the hero in your book? And I couldn't really find one. I thought for a second you might be the hero in the book, but your character is more like Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. You're in the story sort of on the side, observing it and commenting on it. But I don't think, like Gatsby, I don't think anyone in this comes off as heroic.
Yeah.
They're very textured. They're not all villains, but they don't come out this way. And I guess as this like Nick Carraway character wandering through this world, you talk in the book about a lot of your feelings and emotions going through. And I actually wrote down a list. But I was curious, as you went through this world and now that you're out the other side, what were some of the feelings and emotions you had as you were going on this journey?
Yeah, I love this question. And, it's interesting, and no one's asked me this before, but I wanted to write a story about this market partly, but also where global cyber war was headed. From where I sat at the New York Times, the first big moment in my career there was China hacking the New York Times. And like the Google Aurora attack, it was the first time that we realized that journalists, not just major corporations, but journalists were targets for nation state attacks. And since that moment, every year it seems I'm covering waves of new nation state attacks, many coming from adversaries that we had underestimated would acquire those capabilities as quickly as they did. So I wanted to talk about the market and the fact that the market was drifting abroad, and also that these wave of attacks were coming and they were hitting us more frequently and they were hitting more critical systems. And I wanted to write this for my mom, and I wanted to wake her up and show her, what I've been up to for the last 10 years. And I didn't want to write this for the technical audience. And so one day I went out to lunch with a publisher and I described what I wanted to do with this book. And he said, yeah, but who's your donkey? And I said, what do you mean, who's my donkey? And he said, who is the character that's going to carry the narrative all the way through? And there was no single person that could walk through every part of this book. It dates, sometimes I jump back to the Cold War and the Project Gunman operation to uncover the Soviet bug at the US Embassy. And sometimes I'm in Argentina, and sometimes I'm at the S4 conference. And I knew that unfortunately I was going to have to be there and hold my mom's hand through a large part of this narrative. And that meant sort of sharing my own journey with the reader. And in the beginning of the book, I'm truly an idiot. I'm just sort of like this outsider who stumbles into this world and is like, what is this? What is this thing, that this dirty little secret that the government has, that they can't talk about, that zero-day brokers can't talk about, that they're stockpiling holes in software? This seems really bad. What is this thing? And by the end, I think I have a more nuanced perspective, which is we need to be doing cyber offense. If we had another 9/11 tomorrow and we weren't doing these things, then everyone would ask, why, how did we miss this? Why weren't we looking there? Why weren't we looking at those systems? So I'm not saying let's stop cyber offense, but I'm saying if we're going to throw stones of that kind, if we're going to be hacking into ICS systems in Russia and Iran and who knows where else, why are we not putting more serious energy towards our own defense? So in terms of my emotions, I mean, the overwhelming one was just fear of being a layman outsider walking into this very secretive technical world. You are on Twitter too. You know what InfoSec Twitter is like. No one wanted to talk about this world. And so I always knew that even if I spent several years on this thing, I was only going to be scratching the surface of it. And I knew I was going to have to tell it in a way that my mom could understand. And anytime you do that, anytime you dumb down the language, I'd like to think I'm democratizing the language, you are going to get eaten alive. So I would say my overwhelming reaction and overwhelming emotion through the whole book writing process was just one of fear and intimidation. And I think that's why it took 7 years, because sometimes it would just become so scary to think about what the Twitter reaction would be. I would just have to close my computer and put my laptop away for 6 or 7 months. And then some of the other emotions were just surprised to see that actually there were so many people in this market who shared my concerns, that they weren't unfounded. I spoke with one of the original zero-day brokers, the guy I call Jimmy Sabian in the book, because we spoke on the condition I not use his real name. And he also shared the same concerns I did, which was, listen, when I was doing this in the 90s, we were selling to the Pentagon, and I had a rough idea of how these tools would be used. But these days, every country on earth, with the exception of Antarctica, and maybe Jim Lewis added yesterday, the Vatican, is in this business and are stockpiling these tools. And they all have their own reasons for using them. And in a lot of cases, in my day-to-day job at the New York Times, I was seeing how those tools were getting used. Surveillance of dissidents and journalists, and Twitter critics of the Gulf monarchies. And I knew that there were other countries out there that, when I started on this beat, did not have the capabilities of the United States, and that they still didn't have the capabilities of the United States or Five Eyes, but that they could acquire them off the shelf. And they might not be Stuxnet, but they would be sophisticated enough to do serious damage. And that we were not taking that seriously. Where I sit in Silicon Valley, the operating MO is still move fast and break things, keep shipping, get your product to market. Software is eating the world. Let's go. And no one was thinking about all the ways that that virtualization could be used against us.
Well, I definitely want to give you a compliment in the sense of the donkey analogy, or the person going along for the journey. That works. I think that's really important for the lay reader, your target audience. As you clearly even state that in the book, this is for the lay reader. There's a sentence that says that. And I think that really worked. And I think the fear and the intimidation comes through there really well. Another thing that came through to me was a little bit, well, not a little bit, frustration and disgust. Frustration, the fucking salmon comes up several times in the book whenever people won't answer your questions, but almost more frustration and disgust that the market has evolved to where it is. And you even call the market an incoherent mess. And you seem to be really upset. I'll put up a quote here that says it's going to continue so long as the United States continues to be one of the zero-day market's biggest sponsors. This is unlikely to change. I guess one of the questions I had for you is, wasn't this market inevitable? And isn't it always going to be inevitable? Is this something that maybe just would have been delayed a little bit? Or do you think that this market actually could be somewhat regulated or controlled?
It's a great question, and that's the first question Stuart Baker asked when I spoke with him. His criticism was, this is inevitable, and I think yes, it was probably inevitable, but also did we have to facilitate it and enable it the way that we have here in the United States? And when I say that, I'm thinking of the fact that, first of all, I'm thinking of Eternal Blue. I'm thinking of a situation where we claim to have these discussions. We claim to have a vulnerability equities process. We claim to take seriously the risk that we're creating when we hold on to a 0-day. And we think about how widely used the software is and what the blowback would be if it got into the wrong hands and what the damage would be to the relationship between the IC community and Silicon Valley. And if you just look at Eternal Blue, which is, one of the only prisms we are able to look at this from, because so little about this market and these programs has ever been disclosed, you see that everything we've said we take into consideration fell apart in the case of this one 0-day exploit that we know they held on to they being the NSA, held on to for more than 5 years in Microsoft Windows, that it would so easily, even after turning it over for patching, get picked up by North Korea and then Russia and cost Pfizer and Merck and all these American companies so much damage. I just think that is one thing I'm thinking of. And when I went back and interviewed people at TAO who used Eternal Blue in the course of their counterintelligence operations, they said, we knew we were, quote, fishing with dynamite. We knew how dangerous it was that we were holding on to this. We knew how dangerous it would be in an adversary's hands or cyber criminals' hands, but it was getting the best counterintelligence we could get. You would be shocked at the intelligence we were able to get using that one exploit. So we never seriously considered turning it over. And what that told me was, no matter what we say publicly, there is clearly a bias in favor of hoarding some of these capabilities if we find a really good one, no matter how many systems it would affect if someone else were to discover it. And I knew that there were more and more countries and adversaries and cyber criminal groups out there looking for, acquiring, developing these capabilities. And so it was no longer this hypothetical moral dilemma. If we were holding on to a 0-day and not telling Microsoft about it, it was getting more likely that someone at some point would find that capability. But the other thing that comes to mind about facilitating that just blew me away was the story I tell in the book about Cyberpoint, recruiting people from inside the NSA to go to Abu Dhabi and do the Emiratis' dirty work for them. And that didn't have to be inevitable. That to me really crosses a line. If we are sending our best and brightest to Abu Dhabi to hack our allies, and they are catching the First Lady's emails, then, Michelle Obama at the time, they were catching her emails in their dragnet. That's more than this was all inevitable. We're really facilitating the spread of that tradecraft and those tools to other countries that did not have the talent or the capabilities on their own. Now, since those programs and that particular contractor were outed by Reuters and others, when I look at LinkedIn and I see who is working for dark matter, which is what Cyberpoint became in Abu Dhabi, and some of the subsidiaries, they've all gone through various name changes. These programs have been outed. I see that a lot of their employees these days are coming from China. So maybe that was inevitable. If we weren't going to provide them with the skills and tradecraft, they would find it elsewhere, perhaps. But I think that it is worth raising the question, and this was what I really wanted to hone in on the book, is how big of a role did the United States play in expediting and facilitating these programs, and sort of facilitating their spread abroad? And maybe it's all inevitable, but we hold ourselves to a higher standard here, at least, based on our rhetoric. And so it just seemed like these programs are headed down a dangerous path, particularly if you're talking about hoarding 0 days that could be used in an attack on the power grid.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, the 0 day, and the 0 days are the through line in the book. So I understand why there was a focus on those. You have to have some through line to keep the reader involved, especially the lay reader. To me, it's more of an issue I've had for a long time, of the focus on offensive, that it seems like, and we've even heard the director of NSA, multiple directors of NSA say, we can't defend ourselves, so we're going to just be able to hit them really hard if they hit us. And
right.
you had a quote that I thought was really good on the Cyber Law podcast. And you said the book is about incentives and how the incentives are pushing us to be more vulnerable rather than to increase defense. Have you given any thoughts, because that quote really resonated with me, have you given any thought to what type of incentives would be helpful on the defense security side?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the person that I've really spent some time talking to about this is Gary McGraw. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to plagiarize his idea here, which is we should create incentives for companies that treat security seriously, that make a serious internal commitment to security, such as tax credits. For a company that undergoes a serious penetration test, I'm not talking about a compliance checklist, but a serious penetration test, and some auditor can say they don't use outdated software, they use multi-factor authentication, they have strong password management, they have regular patching protocols, they have air-gapped their crown jewels. They should be rewarded for that. We should create incentives for that, because the fact of the matter is, we, the American Society and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, are unwilling to put in place any regulation that, with any teeth at least, that forces critical infrastructure operators to meet a bare standard of security. And so if we're not going to do that, then I think we do have to talk about market and incentives. And I think one possible idea would be tax credits to companies that make a serious internal commitment to security. I come out at the end of the book, I actually think it's time to penalize companies and impose fines on companies like SolarWinds when the password to their software update mechanism is SolarWinds123. I just don't think that companies that allow their software to be inside our nuclear labs and the Department of Energy and Treasury and Justice, et cetera, commerce, should be let off scot-free if they have not made a serious internal commitment to their security and that they're used as some kind of conduit. Now, not every company should be expected to defend itself from a Russian intelligence unit. That's just an impossible ask. But I think we can knock out a lot of threats just by making sure that our systems are fully patched and we have multi-factor authentication and our employees know not to click on phishing emails and that we do have strong password protocols, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know
Okay.
how else to do it.
Okay. We could get into a discussion about the NERC SIP regulations, and FERC is actually looking at some incentives, so there are some things in that. But I have to get to the ICS part, the critical infrastructure part of this. So let's talk a little bit about that. And I guess maybe the big question is, do you think today the Russians, let's stick with the Russians, but you could say Russian, Chinese, Iranians, but let's say, do you think the Russians are able to black out a large section of the nation, let's say 10 million people? Do you think they're in a position today where they're able to do this?
I don't know. I know they're inside our systems. I know that. And I know that maybe it's not 10 million people. I think what saves us in some ways is that the grid is so decentralized, just like our elections are so decentralized, and that somehow that's the only thing keeping anyone from a full-scale attack on our elections. But like the elections, let's just stick with the analogy for a second. I always think that's a ridiculous argument that we're so decentralized, no one could influence the election with a hack. I actually think all they would have to do is go to a key county in a swing state and disenfranchise a large number of people by switching up their voter registration information, and they just could possibly change an election. I think the same thing is probably true for a power grid attack. I don't think they might not hit 10 million people, but if you can go to a critical metropolis and shut the power off and keep it off, then I think you could do some serious damage. And if you could combine that with, say, attack on a water treatment facility, which we also know is perfectly plausible, and a ransomware attack on our hospitals, and coordinate those attacks in some fashion, I don't think it matters whether you take the power out for 100,000 people or 10 million people. If you could do that for 100,000 people and keep the lights off and make it impossible for patients to get to the hospital, et cetera, I think you have yourself a pretty significant cyber-induced terror attack. And those are the things I worry about more than an all-out, massive blackout like the kind we saw in the Northeast 20 years ago.
Well, so I like your book, okay? And I would say my short review, I'm actually going to write up a review the next week, but my short review is, if you're an ICS security professional, this is the book that you tell your families and friends to read to understand why you do what you do, right? Because it's understandable by them. It's a compelling story. They're going to enjoy the book, and then they'll get a better idea of what you do. The issue I have with the book, and I really wanted to be careful because I reread that sentence you wrote many, many times, that this is for a lay person and technical people could nitpick these things. So I wanted to say, I don't want to be that person. But there were just all these quotes. I put one up here. The Russian hackers were so deeply embedded in the critical infrastructure, they were only one step from taking everything down. I think on Pivot, you said they were 2 clicks away from taking everything down. I could put up many, many quotes, but and there was really only one area where I thought it was glaringly wrong. That was the Ukraine thing, where you said that the Russians turned the power back on after 6 hours, when in fact people went out to the substations. The Ukrainians turned the power back on. But in a book that size, one thing is not that big of a deal. But I guess the issue I had was, it seemed like you were trying to, it was almost in a sense on the critical infrastructure like a historical fiction, that you were taking a set of facts and then extrapolating them to their worst possible outcome. And maybe we can talk about an example, like Wolf Creek was an example. This, I couldn't fit the whole quote on here, but you're talking about Wolf Creek power plant. The Russians were inside our nuclear power plants. They were mapping out the networks and such, but they were only on the office network. So I would think that something like that, you could say they were trying to get into the plant networks, or they were trying to get into the safety systems, but they weren't there. And there were just many, many examples in the book where when you read it carefully, you can't say that it's wrong, because no one, it's possible, I guess, but everything was pushed to its most, I guess, hysterical possibility. So do you have any reporting or analysis that would actually say that they're inside the grid, that they're inside the nuclear systems, the systems that control the nuclear plants and the safety systems? Do you have reporting of that the industry just isn't aware of?
Well, I think the most glaring example was that DHS screenshot that they published a few years ago, which actually showed Russia's hands on the switches of the grid. That was the first time that we knew that they had gone beyond the enterprise networks and were actually inside the OT systems. So that's one. The other thing is, that quote that you're putting on the screen right now, that was in the context of Stuxnet. When we hacked Natanz with Israel, when the US and Israel hacked Natanz, and got into the industrial controls and got into the centrifuges, or the rotors that spin the centrifuges. What that was a counter-proliferation operation, right? What Russia was doing, getting into our grid and trying to map out the systems at Wolf Creek and some of the other nuclear plants, was not a counter-proliferation effort. It was an espionage effort aimed at battlefield preparation. And I think when you talk to most people who track Sandworm and Berserk Bear and some of the other Russian actors that have been caught in some of these critical infrastructure attacks, they will tell you, like John Holtquist, I think I've quoted him in the New York Times saying, at first we thought maybe this was an intelligence operation. Maybe this was a theft of intellectual property. But after they turned off the lights in Ukraine, it became clear that they're not in our systems scouting around for the price of gas. They are in there to try and suss out what they need to do in the event they would have to do some harm. That is the only way at this point to understand what those operations look like. And on the Ukraine thing, what the guys on the ground, and I'm blanking on Ole, I forget what the name of his firm is, but what he said was, yes, and I get that Ukraine, turned the lights back on themselves. But you could see that Russia had gone to serious effort to make sure that the lights stayed off for more than a couple hours, rummaging through their backup systems, making sure the lights were off for operators who were coming to try and get the power back on at the substations. And had they wanted to, they could have attacked those same systems again and again and again and again, but they stopped where they did. And that is why security researchers in Ukraine thought this was really a dry run, a test run for some other kind of attack. And what they told me was that they believe that it was a test run for some kind of future attack where they would use the access and the knowledge that they already have of our critical infrastructure to do the same thing here, given the right geopolitical trigger.
I think I'm on the same page with you in terms of the motivations. Why they're visiting these power plants, why they're visiting these oil companies. I think you say sometimes you called it knocking on the front door or something like that. You had some phrase that you used a few times. And they're definitely getting into the enterprise networks, and in some cases, not so much on the grid, but other places they're getting into the control systems as well. And you don't do that if you're a nation state, because you do it in preparation for when you want to use it. So I'm with you. I'm not arguing at all with the intention of what they're trying to do. I guess the problem I have is if I were to give this book to someone to read, they might think that they were much further along than they actually are, just based on things. I mean, you even, I think in the, I have the quote here somewhere, but at the end there, you talk about Iranians penetrating our dam systems related to the Bowman Avenue Dam. Well, yes, they knocked on the door of an internet-connected dam, but that's not really that big of a deal. So maybe it's a quibble again because it's for the lay audience, but it just seemed like it made the current status seem a lot dire than it had to be. And I'm just curious why didn't you try to add a few sentences of nuance to say they're almost there, they're trying there. The way I read the book is you were saying more, they're there, they're ready today. And
Yeah,
I guess
I
if
think
you feel that way, that's true. But that's not what I see.
I think if you look at each of these attacks in isolation, they're not that big of a deal, right? Like, okay, an Iranian hacker got into the controls of the Bowman Dam, but it was the wrong Bowman Dam, and it just so happened that Bowman Dam was under construction that weekend or whatever it was. Oh, we just had this attack on the water treatment facility. Yeah, that's scary, but someone caught it and they were able to shut it down. And we have additional sensors that might have caught it on the way. And oh, the Sands Casino thing. Well, Sheldon Adelson said some things, and we don't know it's just every single attack. If you look at it in isolation, sure, you need to caveat it and say, this could have been bad, but it actually wasn't that bad because it was more like a close call. But what I did with this book, and it was really helpful for me to process everything I've covered over the last 10 years, because it's been such a fire hose of attacks, is when you step back and you look at all of these things, and I say this in the book, is we haven't had that mushroom cloud attack yet. When I started on this story, people were constantly warning me of the Cyber 9/11 and Cyber Pearl Harbor. And I would always ask, and I say this in the book, okay, well then how long do you predict that will happen? And they would say 18 to 24 months every single time. That's it's been 10 years. We haven't had it, but we are having a lot of close calls. And they are happening much more frequently. And we saw that screenshot with Russia's fingers on the power switches. And by the end of the book, part of getting back to your question about my learning journey, I hate the Cyber Pearl Harbor analogy, because it's such a distraction from where we already are, which is things are really bad right now, but we are very close to some kind of critical infrastructure attack. We know in so many cases that these nation states have gotten into our critical systems. And it doesn't have to be the power grid. It could be the continued onslaught of ransomware attacks on our hospital systems. It could have been that water treatment facility attack if someone hadn't been sitting at their computer watching their cursor move around while they upped the level of lye in the water. And again, I very much sympathize with the viewpoint that you can't scare people, that FUD is a dangerous thing. But I actually think at this point, we've leaned too far back on this. I think the industry has been so vocal against those who've warned of a critical infrastructure attack and accused them of being a snake oil salesman and marketing FUD. But I actually think that at this point, the possibility of a very serious attack happening is very real. And I think we've actually done a disservice by screaming FUD at anyone who raises that possibility. And I thought it was time to put all of this in a chronology. And when you look at the chronology, you see that, we might have had one almost close call attack on a dam a few years ago, and Russia was in our systems, but they didn't do anything. But these days, these attacks are happening so quickly from so many different corners simultaneously. We are the most targeted nation state on earth when it comes to nation state attacks and ransomware attacks. I think I haven't seen the latest statistics, but we are the most targeted, and we're not acting like we're the most targeted because we're continuing to hook up everything we possibly can to the internet. We're software is eating up the United States, so we're not stopping to consider what all of this virtualization is and connection could mean, especially considering the fact that we continue to see nation states trying to hack into our airports, our towns, our cities, our power grid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So actually, where I come out on this is that, yeah, piecemeal, each attack isn't that bad. But when you start to look at it together, it's a lot more serious than I think we give the situation credit for.
And I think that's fair. I think if you were to take like someone like me who's focused on ICS critical infrastructure, you take someone in the vulnerabilities equities process, you take someone who sells or buys or sells 0 days or any of the other segments, they're probably going to find some things where they're saying, well, a few more sentences, a few more paragraphs would have been helpful to position this better. But the book really does kind of shake the layperson by the shoulders and say, hey, you need to be aware of this, and yet also give them an interesting story to take them on that journey. So again, that's why I read that sentence so carefully, that it wasn't written for me. So I probably shouldn't be too upset about that. And the parts that I knew less about, I really enjoyed quite a bit. The 0 day market, I knew nothing about that. That was the most fascinating part. The Echo Party in Argentina was fascinating to me. All these things were fascinating. So it's a great book. I do recommend it. Congratulations on writing it. Writing any book is a major accomplishment, but to have one as successful as you did is great. And I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you. I was just at a play date for my toddler, and the other kid's dad worked in this industry. And so he said, I see, your book has gotten these great reviews in mainstream press. And then I see the usual nitpicking and criticism from the InfoSec Twitter world. And I said, yeah. And it hits me hard when I read those. And he said, yeah, but the problem is if they liked it, if they loved it, then you wouldn't be seeing great reviews in the mainstream press because it wouldn't have been readable for mainstream audiences. So, that made sense to me, and I knew that was going to be a thing. I knew people like you who are so steeped in ICS security were going to hate the parts about ICS security. And I knew the people in the 0 day market or who conduct 0 day exploit trainings were going to hate the part about 0 day exploit trainings. And I knew that some of the Argentines were going to hate the section on Echo Party, which I think Yvonne Arce did. But a lot of people still in these industries also reached out and said, I really appreciated this, and have actually helped flesh out a lot of the things I didn't know. My Signal app has been blowing up with people saying, you forgot about this part and this part. So I have to do some updates for the paperback edition, and it'll be a little bit more juicy. But yeah, I mean, it's a hard story to tell without scaring the bejesus out of people. And I come out on this idea, and you put it up earlier, which is, if we don't do something, if we don't stop and take stock of our vulnerability and where we are right now, we are so screwed, because every incentive model just leads us down a road of further vulnerability. From an individual level, I just want what I want, and I want it right now, and I want it from my phone. And from a business level, no one is thinking about security as anything more than a money loser. People are still just trying to get their product to market first and gain as much market share before their competitors. They're not thinking about the security of their code. And from a government perspective, what we saw with NotPetya and Eternal Blue and my interviews with Mike Rogers and others after the fact was that there was no remorse for holding on to a 0-day in Microsoft Windows for more than 5 years, even though they knew it would be dangerous, because the counterintelligence they were getting from that 0-day was just so good. And so I think at this point, if that is the road we're headed down, I think it's really important to democratize these conversations and bring in people from other fields. I think if left the way that things are, if we leave things to the status quo, if we leave these discussions to classified government corridors and the information security community, I don't think anything will change. I really think we have to break out these conversations and wake everyone else up and say, hey, there are serious trade-offs we're making here. And that's the problem is in InfoSec, people have a really hard time communicating what they're saying to the average American. I didn't even understand half the criticisms of the book from some of the information security people. I don't understand their explanations. And, I think that there is a lot of trauma in the information security world because of things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Any effort to enact legislation or regulations in this area has always been written in the dumbest way and has blown back on in a lot of ways. And so I think in general, the culture in this world has been, we know best, everyone else is an idiot. Anyone who raises the talks about just how serious the threat is stoking FUD. And we know best, and no one else should bother coming in here and trying to take a crack at it. And I think that's not getting us to a better place in security. So I think my goal with the book was to really crack this wide open and make everyone realize, just how vulnerable we are and that things have to change, and to put pressure on the system to change things, not in a dumbheaded way, but I say at the end of the book, there's no silver bullets here. These problems and these questions are all very difficult. Even after this whole journey I've been on, I actually don't think we should automatically turn over 0 days for patching. But I do think we need to better hold ourselves to the criteria we say that we are taking into consideration when we do hoard a 0-day. And so, there are no easy answers. And I hope that the book gets these discussions started, which it has. So there you go.